Imagine this. You're sitting at home, watching late-night television. A commercial comes on. The screen fades to black, and then a child's face. Thin arms, hollow cheeks, eyes so deep with hunger that they pierce through the glass. A soft, trembling voice says, "For just $10, you can change my life." You reach for your wallet. $10 isn't much, right? You send it, and you feel good. But what if I told you that money never reached that child? That it was used instead to buy champagne, luxury cars, and a Beverly Hills mansion? Tonight, this isn't fiction. This is the true story of the charity that stole millions from the poor, and the whistleblower who risked everything to bring it down. Evil doesn't always come in shadows. Sometimes it smiles, shakes your hand, and asks for a donation. The ads showed children in dusty villages holding empty bowls. But here's the dark truth. Many of those children never received a single meal. Some didn't even exist. Investigators later discovered that stock photography sites supplied many of the faces. The crying boy in one ad? His photo came from a European catalog, not an African orphanage. And for the few real children photographed, promises were broken. Schools were never built. Clinics never opened. Food never delivered. One aid worker later said. The children became props. Their suffering was stage theater, designed to open wallets. Donors thought they were saving lives. But the truth about those children was darker than anyone imagined. When compassion is exploited, the wound it leaves lasts longer than hunger. It's easy to look back and say, "I would never fall for that." But in truth, we're all vulnerable. Because we all want to believe our small actions can make a difference. Reynolds understood that. He weaponized hope. He sold kindness as a product. And the world bought it, by the millions. Hope is powerful, but when it's sold as a product, it can become the most dangerous weapon of all. By the time Anna closed that cabinet drawer, the story was no longer about donors or children or charity. It was about a choice: stay silent and keep her job, or speak out and risk everything. Her decision would ignite an investigation that exposed one of the most disgraceful frauds in modern history. But before the truth came to light, the world would continue to see David Reynolds as a saint. And the money, millions of it, would keep pouring in. Because the greatest trick Reynolds ever pulled was convincing the world he was saving it. At first, the charity seemed untouchable. Children's Future International had grown from a small nonprofit to a global brand in under a decade. Their logo was everywhere: billboards, bus stops, even Super Bowl halftime ads. But behind the glossy exterior, small inconsistencies began to surface. Anna Morales, the junior administrator, noticed it first. Receipts didn't line up. An invoice claimed $400,000 was spent on nutritional supplements for a famine zone in Ethiopia. But Anna had checked the shipping logs herself. No cargo had ever left port. When she quietly asked her supervisor about it, she was told, "Don't worry about the details. Focus on your filing." It was the first time she realized the charity had secrets. Lies don't begin with a scream. They begin with a whisper that no one dares question. The public thought their donations went to bags of rice, vaccinations, clean water projects, but the money's real journey was far different. Bank transfers showed it hopping from the charity's main account to a series of shell corporations in Delaware, then funneled offshore to accounts in the Cayman Islands. From there, it returned as consulting fees to companies secretly owned by David Reynolds himself. When auditors finally traced it, they discovered $6.2 million spent on luxury cars, $12 million wired for real estate, including a 12,000 square foot mansion in Beverly Hills, $1.5 million at European resorts, billed as field research. And while Reynolds gave public speeches about tight budgets and stretching every dollar, he was privately collecting a salary of $1.8 million a year, higher than the President of the United States. The donors thought they were buying food for children, but investigators discovered what those children really were, and it was worse than they imagined. Greed is a fire, and when you feed it with trust, it burns down everything in its path. The most devastating revelation wasn't financial. It was human. The crying girl on the brochure with the tagline, "Save Me." Her face had been lifted directly from a stock photography site. The boy with the empty bowl, staring into the camera with tears streaming down his cheeks? He wasn't from Kenya or Uganda, as claimed. He was a child model from Romania whose photo was licensed for a $12 advertising fee. Even the celebrity-backed commercials were built on deception. Actors were hired to pose as aid workers, kneeling beside children they'd never met, reciting lines about transforming lives. One journalist later wrote, "They weren't selling aid. They were selling misery, packaged, polished, and priced at $10 a month." When suffering becomes a marketing tool, compassion becomes currency. Anna wrestled with her conscience. She had rent to pay, a son to raise. Speaking out could cost her everything. But silence meant complicity. One night, working late, she stumbled upon a misfiled document, a contract with a public relations firm outlining a campaign strategy. It wasn't about feeding children. It was about maximizing donor conversion rates. The firm was instructed to use images of children with visible ribs and oversized eyes because they tested higher in emotional response surveys. Anna pushed the papers away, trembling. This wasn't just fraud. This was exploitation on a grotesque scale. She copied the documents, hid them in her bag, and walked out of the office with the evidence that would later bring the empire down. The world believed Reynolds was a saint, but the papers in Anna's bag would prove he was something else entirely. Silence in the face of wrongdoing doesn't protect the innocent. It shields the guilty. The first story broke in a local paper. Questions raised over children's future international spending. At first, few paid attention. Reynolds dismissed it as a smear campaign by jealous rivals. Donors brushed it off. After all, wasn't he still on TV with celebrities, still endorsed by politicians, still plastered on every billboard in Times Square? But cracks spread quickly. Other journalists picked it up. Documents leaked. Former employees spoke out. And then came the headline that would change everything. Fake charity stole millions from the poor. A lie can travel the world in seconds. But when the truth finally catches up, it strikes like thunder. The mask was off. Donors who had once cried at Reynolds commercials now wept in anger. Celebrities scrambled to cut ties. Governments announced investigations. But this was only the beginning. Because if the reveal showed the fraud, the investigation would show just how deep it ran. The documents told one story. But when investigators followed the money trail, what they uncovered would shock even the most cynical. Anna Morales didn't see herself as a whistleblower. She was just an office worker with a conscience. But the moment she slipped those documents into her bag, she stepped onto a path she couldn't turn back from. She contacted Rachel Lee, an investigative journalist known for exposing corporate fraud. At first, Rachel was skeptical. Fraud in a nonprofit? It wasn't unheard of, but this charity had too much shine, too many celebrities, too much credibility. But when Rachel opened the manila envelope Anna slid across the diner table, her skepticism vanished. Inside were fake invoices for food supplies totaling millions, contracts with PR firms describing emotional manipulation campaigns, a memo signed by David Reynolds himself, authorizing funds for executive retreats at luxury resorts. Rachel looked up from the papers, her coffee forgotten. If this is real, it's the biggest charity fraud of the decade. The truth is like a seed. Once planted, it can crack even the strongest concrete. Rachel and her team began digging. They subpoenaed financial records, cross-referenced donor reports, and tracked shell companies across states. What they found shocked even seasoned investigators. Only 2% of donations went to actual aid. Reynolds and his executives created 15 shell corporations to launder money. Partner schools, listed in reports, were empty lots. Entire villages supposedly fed for a year had never seen a single bag of rice. One forensic accountant described it bluntly. It was a business model built on suffering. The product wasn't food or medicine. The product was pity. The documents painted a damning picture. But one discovery, hiding in plain sight, would seal Reynolds' fate once and for all. Money leaves trails, even when buried under lies. The question is, who's willing to follow them? The growing noise caught the attention of federal regulators. Soon, the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit was involved. Agents raided the charity's headquarters, seizing computers, hard drives, and filing cabinets. One agent later recalled. It was like opening a theater backstage. Everything the public saw was carefully choreographed. But behind the curtain, chaos, greed, and fraud. They discovered offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands linked directly to Reynolds. Emails between board members openly discussing how to maximize lifestyle benefits. A hidden ledger showing the real numbers. $50 million raised, less than $1 million spent on aid. Fraud thrives in the dark. Shine a light, and the shadows scatter. But the most damning piece of evidence wasn't hidden in offshore accounts. It was on Reynolds' own laptop. Agents found a PowerPoint presentation titled, Charity Growth Strategy, 5-Year Plan. Slide after slide laid it out. Expand donor emotional capture campaigns. Focus on recurring monthly pledges. Instead of one-time gifts, increase executive benefits by 40% over the next 5 years. And the final slide? A photo of Reynolds himself, smiling, with the tagline, If you're not living well, you can't help others live. That line would later be read aloud in court, to gasps from the audience. The investigation had enough to indict Reynolds. But what prosecutors revealed in the courtroom shocked even his loyal supporters. Greed always writes its own confession. Sometimes, all you need is the courage to read it aloud. During depositions, former employees came forward that a marketing director admitted that entire ad campaigns were staged. That an accountant revealed he was ordered to falsify numbers. A driver testified that he delivered charity supplies not to airports, but to Reynolds' home. But the most powerful testimony came from Anna. On the witness stand, she described how she found the hidden files, how she wrestled with fear, how she realized silence would make her complicit. Her words were simple, but they cut deep. Not one child got the help we promised. Not one. For a moment, even Reynolds looked down at the floor. Sometimes the quietest voice in the room carries the loudest truth. As the investigation unfolded, the public turned. Donors wept on live television, saying they felt robbed of their faith in humanity. Celebrities who once championed Reynolds now condemned him, erasing old endorsements from social media. Politicians who once praised him scrambled to distance themselves. Headlines screamed across front pages. Fake charity robbed the poor. CEO of hope turns out to be CEO of fraud. The outrage was global, and for the first time, the smiling image of David Reynolds no longer symbolized compassion. It symbolized betrayal. Trust takes years to build, seconds to break, and a lifetime to repair. By the time investigators closed their case, Reynolds' empire of lies had crumbled. What began with whispers in a filing cabinet ended in full-blown scandals splashed across the world stage. But even with mountains of evidence, one question lingered. How did Reynolds pull it off for so long? The investigation exposed the crime. But the real mystery was why so many people, donors, celebrities, even governments, failed to see the truth until it was too late. When the dust settled and Reynolds was behind bars, one question haunted everyone. How did this happen for so long? The fraud wasn't a slip-up. It wasn't a one-time mistake. It was a machine, operating for nearly a decade, siphoning millions while the world applauded. Donors asked, how could we have been so blind? Celebrities asked, did we really endorse a scam? And regulators, embarrassed, admitted, we never saw the warning signs. The truth is chilling. Reynolds didn't just trick people. He engineered belief. Deception doesn't survive by hiding in shadows. It survives by dazzling you with light. Reynolds understood something most people don't. Emotions beat logic. He hired entire teams of marketers, not aid workers. Their job was to test which images made people cry. Fastest, children with tears in. Their eyes performed better than smiling ones. Empty bowls raised more. Donations than school books. Flies on a child's face. Increased contributions by 14%. The ads weren't about truth. They were about triggers. Every frame, every word, was designed to bypass reason and go straight to the heart. One former PR consultant confessed, we weren't raising money for children. We were selling sadness as a product. But pity wasn't Reynolds' only weapon. He had something even more powerful, something that made celebrities, Politicians and even watchdog groups look away. When emotions are for sale, even compassion can be commodified. Reynolds knew the world trusted authority, so he borrowed it. He stood beside famous actors at galas. He accepted awards from political leaders. He plastered photos of handshakes with mayors and presidents across the charity's website, the average donor. This meant legitimacy. If the president shook his hand, who were they to question him? One investigator later remarked, the endorsements acted like armor. Every time someone raised concerns, they were drowned out by the roar of celebrity approval. This wasn't charity. It was theater, and the world was applauding. When people see someone applauded, they rarely ask if the applause is deserved. But what about oversight? Shouldn't watchdogs have caught it? In theory, yes. Nonprofits are required to file reports. But Reynolds' team was masterful at paperwork. They padded reports with fabricated numbers, fake school names, and photographs lifted from other organizations. Regulators filed his reports away, stamped with approval, never bothering to check if the schools actually existed. An auditor admitted privately, "We trusted the documents because they looked professional. We never went to see the villages ourselves." And so, the silence of regulators became complicity. But perhaps the most haunting mystery wasn't the fraud itself. It was the people who wanted to believe, even when the truth was staring them in the face. Negligence is the quiet accomplice of every great crime. Here's the hardest truth. Donors weren't tricked by complexity. They were tricked by their own desire to believe that a retired nurse who donated monthly said it best. "I saw the ads, and I cried. I wanted to believe my little check was feeding that little girl. Maybe I didn't want to look too closely." Reynolds exploited this longing. He gave people what they wanted, not the truth, but the feeling of helping. And for years, that feeling kept the machine alive. The greatest frauds don't just fool people. They give people what they desperately want to believe. The investigation revealed Reynolds wasn't unique. He was just louder, slicker, greedier. Watchdog groups pointed to other cases. The Cancer Fund of America raised $187 million, spent less than 3% on patients. Kids Wish Network, accused of funneling millions to telemarketers instead of sick children. Even well-known charities like the Wounded Warrior Project faced scandals for bloated executive spending. The mystery deepened. Was Reynolds a lone wolf, or just one face of a much bigger problem? The deeper investigators dug, the more they realized this wasn't just one man's fraud. It was an industry designed to look holy while hiding greed. Sometimes evil doesn't break the rules. It hides behind them. In the end, the mystery wasn't about how Reynolds tricked the world. It was about why so many chose not to question him. Because questioning meant facing an uncomfortable truth, that kindness itself can be manipulated, and that the face of charity can hide the heart of a thief. Reynolds was exposed, tried, and sentenced. But when the gavel fell, the damage couldn't be undone. And the children, the ones who were promised hope, were left with nothing. When compassion is betrayed, the wound isn't just financial, it's spiritual. The courthouse was packed. Rows of journalists, furious donors, and even former employees filled the benches. For years, David Reynolds had been celebrated as a humanitarian. Now he stood before a judge, accused of being one of the worst con men in modern history. The prosecution wasted no time. They presented the stolen millions, the offshore accounts, the staged commercials, the fake invoices. Each exhibit was like a nail in the coffin of Reynolds' public image. One prosecutor described the fraud as a theater of suffering, orchestrated for profit. When the words echoed through the courtroom, some donors wept. They remembered their checks, their belief, their trust. When truth finally speaks, it echoes louder than any lie. Reynolds, in his trademark suit, still tried to command the room. His lawyers argued that the expenses were necessary business costs. They claimed the luxury retreats were executive training. The mansion? A headquarters residence. At one point, Reynolds even addressed the court himself. "Yes, mistakes were made, but I dedicated my life to helping children. This is nothing but a misunderstanding, exaggerated by those who seek to tear down good men." But as he spoke, the whistleblower Anna sat in the witness box, clutching the papers she had risked her career to expose. The contrast was stark, a man defending his empire and a woman defending the truth. The jury would decide whose voice carried more weight, and when the verdict came, it would shake the room. Excuses are the last refuge of the guilty. Anna's testimony silenced the courtroom. She wasn't a celebrity. She wasn't powerful. She was just a single mother with a stack of documents. She described finding fake invoices, watching money disappear, and realizing no child was ever being helped. She explained the night she walked out of the office with the evidence in her bag. Her voice trembled at first, but grew steady. Not one child. Not one school. Not one promise kept. We betrayed the very people we claimed to serve. The jurors leaned forward. Even the judge's face softened. The courage of one can reveal the corruption of many. After weeks of testimony, the jury filed back into the courtroom. The tension was electric. Guilty, they said, on all counts. Wire fraud, tax evasion, money laundering. David Reynolds, once praised as a savior, was now a convicted felon. The judge called his crimes a betrayal not just of donors, but of humanity itself. And with that, Reynolds was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison. His empire crumbled overnight. The charity was dissolved, assets seized. But for the children whose images were exploited, for the donors whose faith was shattered, the damage was permanent. Reynolds was gone, but the scars he left behind, those would linger long after his prison gates closed. Justice can punish the guilty, but it cannot erase the pain they caused. For donors, the trial was both vindication and devastation. Some received partial refunds from seized assets. Many got nothing. The retired nurse, Ellen Parker, said through tears, "It wasn't about the money. It was about the belief that I helped someone." Now, even that feels stolen. For the real children, those who had been promised schools, meals, and hope, nothing changed. They remained in poverty, their faces used as masks for greed. And for Anna, the whistleblower, life was never the same. She lost her job, faced threats, and lived with fear. Yet she said she had no regrets. "If I stayed silent, the lies would have continued. I couldn't let that happen." Doing the right thing often comes at a cost, but the cost of silence is always greater. Reynolds wasn't the first charity fraudster, and he won't be the last. Watchdog groups warn that fraudulent charities exploit one simple truth. People want to believe their small actions can change the world. And when that belief is manipulated, the betrayal runs deeper than money. The lesson wasn't don't give. The lesson was research before donating. Ask for transparency. Look beyond glossy commercials, because every dollar matters, and so does every question. Compassion is powerful, but compassion without wisdom can be dangerous. David Reynolds now spends his days behind bars, another inmate in a gray jumpsuit. But the story doesn't end with him. It ends with us. With the choices we make when we see suffering on a screen. With the questions we ask before we open our wallets. With the courage we show in holding institutions accountable. Because sometimes the greatest crimes aren't committed in dark alleys or shadowed streets. Sometimes they happen in the bright light of day, smiling, televised, tax-exempt. When you give blindly, you may not be helping the needy. You may be feeding the greedy. Remember this story and give wisely.